I'll get started as you are wandering in and grabbing a cup of tea or coffee or what have you. I'm Larry Jacobs. I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota in the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. And we're very excited about today's program, which is the first of what we hope to be a series with the National Conference of State Legislatures and with their head of elections, Wendy Underhill. It's a great pleasure, and we're quite keen about this. I want to say a quick word about the Certificate in Election Administration, which is very much part of this program. The CEA, or the Certificate in Election Administration, is an online program, 12 credits that can apply to undergraduate degree, graduate degree, and a certificate that's offered by the Board of Regents from the University of Minnesota. 12 credits gets you all that. It's a pioneering online program, best practices with current election officials who are looking to kind of upgrade, as well as for students who want to get into the program. It is accessible 24 hours a day, anywhere in the world, because it is online. Graduates are having a really strong experience getting jobs, and here's information on how you can learn more about it. January 3rd is the cutoff for registration coming in the spring. We've got a whole slew of terrific courses, including one by Tammy Patrick, one of our panelists today, which is very popular and really outstanding discussion about data management. I guess you taught that in the fall, right? Yeah, right. Judd Choate, who many of you will know from Colorado, he's teaching a course on elections and law. I'm teaching a course on strategic management. Whitney Quisenberry teaches a course on election design, which is really terrific. Voter participation, Astrid Ochoa from the Future of California Elections, and Matt Masterson, who's a senior cybersecurity advisor at the US Department of Homeland Security, is teaching one of our 3 courses on election security. We want to encourage you to participate. There's a button at the bottom, Q&A. Please use it. Give us your questions, comments. The panel is going to be very excited to respond and engage with you. And now I want to turn things over to our partner, Wendy Underhill, who's Director of Elections and Redistricting at the National Conference of State Legislatures. Thank you so much, Wendy, for your leadership.
Well, Larry, always good to work with you. So it's this is our 3rd or 4th working together, and I look forward to many more. As you said, this might be the kickoff for a series, and we'll hear some ideas about that. 2020 was a year like no other. You've all heard that said a million times, but no surprise, that's also true of the elections in 2020 as well. And I'm just going to, right from the top, give you my takeaway, which is that 2020 is the year that the American public finally understood that there are 50 ways to run elections, that this is a state function, and that it's not the same in my state than it is in your state. So whether they keep that learning as they go forward remains to be seen. So that's my top line. What we're going to do today is hear from some experts on what their takeaways are. But before we get there, I wanted to suggest that there's a goal today, and that is to provide legislators and election officials with timely, practical, nonpartisan information from the 2020 elections with the goal of improving future elections. So that was a mouthful. The first part, legislators and election officials, that's because the Certificate on Election Administration focuses on the election administrators, no big surprise. The National Conference of State Legislatures focuses on the legislatures, no big surprise. But we believe that if you put those 2 groups of people together, those who make the policy and those who enact the policy, that's when you get the best outcomes in an election. Then I said, well, we're going to look at timely information. We are pretty much past the headlines, the news reporting on this election, and we're way too early for the history books to be written about this election. We're in that middle ground. And here's where we can take memorable stories from 2020, not just stories, but outcomes, while they're fresh in our mind, and use those as fodder for continuous improvement in the elections around the nation. Practical information, we're not talking political science here. No disrespect to those of you who are political scientists, but social science takes a little bit of time, just like writing the history books takes a little bit of time. we're trying to pull together things that will be of use in 2021, maybe 2022, so that we can in fact have an impact on elections, whatever that might be. So we're looking for practical things now. If people have ideas about things that can be tweaked, reformed, undone, changed in any which way, that's what we want to hear about. Not that we're going to adopt all of those, and not that we are going to come up with a reform agenda, but we're just looking for the ideas that are on people's minds. And then I mentioned nonpartisan. It is true that some of our experts today do have a D or an R next to their name, and they'd probably be happy to talk about political analysis. I'd be happy to talk about politics and election administration in some other forum. That's not what we're here today for. We're looking for general observations, ways that can be, ideas that can be made actionable, given that we do live in a political world. So Larry, this is where I want you to kind of describe what you think is inside and outside of our purview, please.
We've done several working sessions with legislators, and one of those legislators, Republican House member Chris Gerlach, after a day of wandering conversation, proposed a grid. And the grid is, we've got some issues that are clearly matters of partisan discord, and we're not going to have actionable, practical progress on that. So the Gerlach grid said, let's put those to the side. Then there are areas where there does appear to be some area where there can be agreement and movement forward that would, work for both the lawmakers and could be implemented. And then the third area is a kind of twilight zone of just, we have to think more about that. And I think this is a terrific starting point for a conversation about those actionable areas with a disciplined focus on, well, there are going to be some areas where there's just too much heat.
Thank you. So you can see which part of that we're trying to reach today. So before I introduce our panelists, I want to say that we have both a Q&A and a chat function. Do put questions in the Q&A. We will answer some of them in there, some of them out loud. We'll see how that goes. In the chat function, just your observations, your thoughts, throw them there. Okay, we have 5 fabulous folks with us today. I'm going to just give a quick description of who they all are, and then if you want to learn more, put it in the chat box and we'll get you a bio, a real bio. Mark Goins is the election director in Tennessee, and he's also a former legislator, so he knows both sides of this equation we're talking about today. Senator Daniel Ivey-Soto from New Mexico has served as the Democratic chair of NCSL's Redistricting Election Standing Committee several times, off and on. Whenever we get the chance, we invite him back to that role. Senator Greg Walker from Indiana has chaired the Senate's election committee there, and he's been kind enough to provide his expertise to NCSL on a number of occasions before. Keesha Gaskins-Nathan has worn many hats in the democracy world, if there is such a thing, and now she serves as the director of the Democratic Practice Program at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And then Tammy Patrick, some of you know her because she does teach at the Humphrey School. She's with the Democracy Fund, and she's also worn the hat of an election official in the past. So Mark, I'm coming at you first. You saw so much action around the nation and in your own state of Tennessee. When you think about either your state or the nation as a whole, how did we cope? How did it go? And what things came up that you think will be either issues or changes that we might expect in the future?
Yeah, from election official standpoint, I think we became unicorns to our family. They heard we existed, they just didn't see us.
Yeah.
And we had to have a 24-hour, 7-day approach to it. With everything that's thrown at us, I think the election officials did a remarkable job. Honestly, part of, I have 95 counties. I work with administrators. Part of the time, they were my cheerleader. Part of the time, I was their cheerleader. I mean, literally the stress that we were under, I guarantee most election officials throughout the nation at one point thought perhaps I should leave this profession. It was really tough. And, you didn't know who was going to be in your office. You didn't know whether somebody's going to have to quarantine, didn't know if you was going to have enough poll officials. But in the end, everyone stepped up. We had enough poll officials. We were able to open up polling locations, but you name it, we dealt with it all. Supply issues, we dealt with folks that didn't want to allow us to use their polling locations, and we dealt with a shortage of funds. And those things all came to a head. But one thing that, when you talk about practically speaking and things that can be done going forward, we had something we had something happen in March that prepared us for November, and we just didn't know it at the time. In March, that was when we had our presidential preference primary, and we literally had a tornado the morning of the election. But the election had to go on. It was 95 counties, only affected, a handful of counties, but those counties it affected, it really affected them. I mean, literally, we had election officials driving around. I remember Tammy Smith and Philip Warren in Wilson County. They literally was telling TEMA, which is a local emergency group here, where the tornado had hit, because we were the first ones out. And one of the things that states may want to consider is, in a situation like that, where you have a statewide election, say something were to happen like that on a presidential election, to set up a mechanism where you can set up a super site or a mega site. And let me explain what we did. When those polling locations were destroyed by the tornado, we found locations that were close to that location, and we would direct voters there. And that's how we conducted the election. And then we created a super site to where you could go to the election commission office. Fast forward, the legislature was in session after the tornado. We saw that the pandemic was about to happen, and we asked the legislature to put health crisis in there as well. When we have a deadline of requesting an absentee ballot that's 7 days before the election. So after 7 days, you can't request an absentee ballot. We had voters, it doesn't say anywhere in the law book that if I have COVID or if I'm quarantined, that I can't vote. It does say in the law book that we can't send someone an absentee ballot after 7 days. So we were able to use those mega sites, those super sites, to vote individuals that had COVID. And I got to tell you, it was a little uneasy if you're an election official, trying to recruit people to vote folks that actually had COVID. But that was something the legislature gave the authority for the local election commission to do. And I had to sign off on it as well. So there was some discretion there. But at the end of the day, the folks that use that site, some of the administrators have told me tears would be in those voters' eyes. Because like I say, you still have a right to vote. And so going forward practically, we've learned some things dealing with an emergency. And there's a lot of things to talk about, the security of the election and other things. But practically speaking, one of the things that we probably weren't prepared for in Tennessee was a healthcare, was a pandemic. But we planned for it after we saw it coming, and we pulled it off in August and November. But it was sleepless nights, and we developed an 80-page comprehensive plan. But it was kind of after after we knew the pandemic was coming. I know we got some other topics that's coming, and I don't want to monopolize all the time, but that's one practical thing. I certainly have some other things that I could throw out there later on.
I really appreciate that you spoke about the amazing work that people did 24/7 to pull off this election. And that was in pretty much every jurisdiction around the nation. So all 10,000 election jurisdictions were working really hard, and appreciate that. And then you brought up the idea of emergencies. And I like the way you so nicely said an emergency in the past became useful for us in the fall. Great attitude on that. So thank you. Senator Ivey-Soto, I'm coming to you next. And just want to hear what you got to say about the election in New Mexico. I know you made some changes there, and then the elections writ large, please. I don't hear you yet.
Certainly, I'll be happy to. Yes, I do want to, since I'm following Mark, I do want to point out that, as you commented, Mark went from being a legislator to being state election director. I used to be state election director in New Mexico, and then I was executive director for the county clerks, and I still provide technical assistance to them, and then I also serve as a legislator. And so as you all are considering the weight of the comments being made, you should all consider the fact that Mark went from what is in Tennessee a part-time job to a full-time job. And I went from what in New Mexico is a full-time job to the only all-volunteer unpaid legislature in the nation. And so you guys can decide who has perhaps better decision-making skills in that process. But nonetheless, this election this year really did strain the ability of election officials to respond to what's happening on the ground, and particularly because the New Mexico Constitution and almost every state constitution provides that it is the legislature that will regulate the manner, time, and places of voting. And so consequently, election administrators have to work within the confines of what the legislature has laid out. Now, that's true in many areas of the law, except that many areas of the law allow greater discretion by those administering a program. But in elections, you have what's called the anti-delegation clause, where you can only delegate so much discretionary authority to election administrators without violating the constitutional mandate that it is the legislature that regulates the manner, time, and place of voting. So that's really one of the constraints that we have with regard to elections, and that was really stressed during this pandemic. And so one of the great things that happened to us is in New Mexico is that so in 2019, we realized that our election code that we currently have in New Mexico was adopted in its current form 50 years ago. And so we decided to work on what we called a 50-year tune-up. And it was a 472-page bill that addressed a wide range of issues in elections. And it turns out that it was a godsend that we did that, because part of what we did, for example, was counting mailed ballots. In New Mexico, we allow mailed ballots to be counted beginning 5 days before the election, but we decided that if in a county there was more than 20,000 ballots, I think it is, that had been sent out, that you could actually count for the 2 weeks prior to the election. And so that we were able to scale based on the numbers that were happening, and that allowed us then in New Mexico on election night to be able to report the mail ballot elections at that time for the most part, along with the early vote ballots and the election day ballots coming in at the end, as opposed to these various different states that could not start counting the ballots until election day. And there was this suggestion that these were new ballots coming in. None of these were new ballots coming in, and these were all simply tallying the recent historical act of people voting by election day. Except it because of how things were reported, it didn't always feel that way to people. And so there are a variety of other places where we made proactive changes in our laws that the folks ended up saying, "Oh my goodness, this was amazing that we did this, and we had no idea this stuff was coming up." However, we did also had a special session in June to deal with the economy, and we also dealt with some things with the elections at that point. And one of the things that we dealt with at that point with the elections is we made all of our polling places voter convenience centers, so that all of our polling places, because many counties were closing some polling places due to the pandemic, we went to a policy that if you find a polling place in your county, go in and vote. You're eligible to vote there. There was no such thing as a polling place where you could not vote. We also did went to a policy with regard to the Native American lands. That at the Native American lands, where in New Mexico we have 22 different Indian nations, tribes, and pueblos, sovereigns within the state of New Mexico. So we provided that you could not close a polling place on Native American land, even if that Native American nation, tribe, or pueblo, if their borders were closed to the rest of the county, in order to help guarantee those people the right to vote. So there were some things that we did that were proactive. All of those things repeal automatically December 31 of this year, because we didn't want anyone to think we were taking advantage of the pandemic to sneak in policy for the future. But what we're doing now is evaluating the various different things that we did to see what we should bring back in this next legislative session in order to adopt as permanent policy. And there were some things we learned. For example, we allowed counties to send applications automatically to voters. Well, a lot of voters, when they got this envelope that said official election mail, they thought it was a ballot that they didn't request, as opposed to an application. And really what we want to encourage is people to go online and request it online, so that we don't have data entry errors when we have to re-enter the information. So I think in the future, instead of sending out applications, we're going to send, in advance of every election, we're going to propose at least to send a postcard, an oversized postcard with the URL where you can request and absentee ballot, the URL and the deadlines where you can update your voter registration, as well as a list of all of the in-person polling locations in your county where you can go vote in person, so that we empower the voters to make the correct choice for themselves. One of the things that I have thought about, given all the litigations taking place, is that there really ought to be a rule that no lawyer can file an election contest case unless they have the certificate from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs in election administration, because what we've seen is the number of lawsuits that have been filed where it's very clear that the attorney writing the complaint does not have an understanding of how election administration works, and does not have an understanding of the flow through the whole process. There's more that I can talk about, but nonetheless, this is, these are things we should look at. I will mention one last thing that I had a conversation with Matt Masterson about when he was still with Homeland Security. Of course, he's moving on now to Stanford University. I also discussed this with Alex Mayorkas, who's been nominated to be the new Secretary of Homeland Security. And that is, there is such thing called FirstNet, which is a first responders network, is one of the 9/11 recommendations that is being built out right now, and in order to allow first responders to communicate. And one of the things that I'm working to do in my state, and that I think Homeland Security, since elections is critical infrastructure, should do, is to create a dedicated channel. And I mention this because this is something that each of you all logged in here can start talking about within your own state. A dedicated channel within FirstNet to have a data channel for election communications, for data, both in terms of reporting election night, in terms of coordinating between different polling places and whatnot, so that you don't have to deal with the potential people hacking those communications. Thank you.
Thank you. You brought up a number of things, and I do want everyone to know that we're kind of keeping a list of topics that come up, and we'll put them in the chat box later on, and people can have responses to it. The two things that popped up for me is a 50-year tune-up. Every 50 years, things have to have a new set of eyes on them. And then that everything you did in 2020 was temporary. And we are being asked at NCSL, are those temporary laws going to be made permanent? And of course, it'll vary from state to state. Senator Walker, would you jump in here? And what did you see in Indiana? And what did you see nationwide? What are some concerns for the future?
Hi, Wendy. Just talk a couple things. We had some conversations earlier about the use of mail ballots, and you would think maybe that's on the list of items where there's no contention, and yet I would argue that depends on where you live. In Indiana, we have a strong contingent within the General Assembly that thinks that mail ballots are a potential source of fraudulent activity, and so they're not encouraged. And yet our clerks are still in 92 counties processing those. So we had to deal with the volume this year. There's been good discussion about allowing for the ability to pre-scan a mail ballot without tallying that ballot. And one of the concerns we've had there is our Constitution says only citizens get to vote. I'm sure your states also have something like that. And if you have someone who is deceased subsequent to their submittal of a mail-in ballot, our clerks have to be able to wait to identify that ballot and remove it from any kind of batch processing or batch file that may have been created in anticipation then of tallying that ballot on election day. And so we're having discussions with various vendors about how to accomplish that. Another issue with the mail ballots, Indiana has actually had a high level of participation, considering that we are not an excuse state. You have to list the reason why you can't go physically to the polling place. On the other hand, we've moved forward now for about almost 10 years with the concept of, I think Mark and Senator Ivey-Soto both talked about these aggregate polling locations. We call them vote centers. They're county specific, but anyone can walk in. We've held those open in various counties for 2 to 4 to 6 to 10 years, it was a pilot that has caught on because of efficiency, best use of personnel, the ability to put your tabulating machines all in a common location, ADA accessible, all those good reasons. And we want to be able to encourage people not to have to worry about getting to the polling place on election day. We had some counties that actually had reduced the number of large aggregate polling centers from multiple to the corners of the county. We had one county that ran with one polling location on election day, and it worked very well. Really good feedback. I call it consumer feedback from the voters. It was in an old mall in the center of the county, in the center of the county seat. They had more square footage to deal with than you can imagine. All the room they needed. Everyone could come in out of the cold instead of being out in the weather in the chute in November, and people loved it. Probably, again, no more than 35% of all voters used it because they had taken advantage of the mail vote and the in-person early voting, as opposed to waiting until election day. I think we have to work harder. I've been in on conversations with the United States Postal Service on the use of tracking of ballots with barcodes and so on. And there's always a lot of finger pointing has resulted. Well, it's the vendors, they can't make the envelope the way we want it. And we've given you the specs, and why can't you do it this way? And I don't feel like we've ever really made an honest effort to resolve that. And I think from a customer service and from a security standpoint, that is going to have to be a greater focus in our state, and I'm sure others do as well. It's one other thing I was going to touch on, if I can remember what it is, but so even within my own caucus, we had bills this past spring, seems like forever ago, suggesting that all polling places, all public school properties shall be accessible as polling places in the various counties. And we had bills that said all schools cannot be used as polling places in the various counties. And they want to make a blanket rule. As of this fall, the discussion has been, particularly from the clerk's standpoint, hardworking people struggling to find places that will open the doors during a pandemic, as Mark mentioned. I think a compromise position could be that all public school facilities may be used, but that a teacher in service day will be applicable so there are no students on the property. That's been proposed for our discussion in January, and we'll see what kind of traction we get with that as well. That's good enough for now.
That's great. I really appreciate that. And that question about schools has come up over and over again. It seems like it is public property, has good parking, and yet there are concerns about security, not just about pandemics, but about physical security as well. So the idea that you might be coming to looks like it's the compromise position. We want the building, but people will get the extra day back as training or similar. Great point. And then about the vote centers, we seem to see some traction in the inbox and the comments on that as well. Some people seem to think that's really working very well. Keesha, I'm coming to you next. You're in a different position than some of the other people. I don't believe you've ever run an election. If I'm wrong, tell us that I'm wrong about that. From your perspective, under the democracy umbrella, what did you see this year and what that might mean for the future? You're on mute. Yeah, there we go.
I'm on mute. No, I have not run elections. My experience with elections is primarily through the democracy field. And I would say my fellow voting rights attorneys, my colleagues from League of Women Voters and other places, and in the philanthropy field would argue, yes, there is a democracy field in this space. And in looking at this election, and in the 25 years I've been working in this space, this was an incredibly unique election. And I think the biggest challenge that we saw this year was probably the lack of trust in the elections this year. I am an election day poll worker and assigned as a Republican in New York. And And it really was a really unique experience watching the people come through this year, I think in a very different way than we've seen. The lack of trust in the system, the lack of trust in the process. And I do think we do have to think beyond some of these specific questions and also thinking about what are the implications for how people experience and engage in elections. How do people experience communications? How we require disclosure at both the state and national level, and how people are able to engage and understand what they're experiencing at all levels, and really thinking about that just as much. And so what does it mean to have a barcode? Does it help? Does it hurt? And certainly some of the challenges, and I think Tammy's going to talk a little bit about some of those questions, about how we use them, what are the implications, what does it mean to have interagency battles, and how those can be leveraged, and what does it mean for to really have a level of statesmanship that really elevates above partisan battles, and what is a role of legislators, and really taking on that role in that work, and ultimately really saying, how do we budget for this? And what does it mean to really say we are going to fund our elections at the level that is necessary to do this work? There was a lot of catch up done this year, a lot of need for philanthropy to come in. And a lot of need for late funding to be able to backfill in these spaces because of the way elections have been sort of forced to run on a shoestring. And so I think there's a lot of questions about the infrastructure around elections and how to be more consistent about these questions. And I think that this year, like many things that were impacted by the pandemic, but elections in particular, I think really demonstrated some problems and challenges in that space.
Fabulous. And I appreciate that you do have election experience because you've been a poll worker. So that brings a whole new perspective to it for you. And you've mentioned sort of the voter confidence piece, and I'm seeing some of that in the chat and the questions as well. And we might circle back around to that. Tammy, you're in the sweep position. You've heard a lot. You've got some things on your mind, I know. Take it away.
Always. Thank you so much. Thanks to both NCSL and the Humphrey School. So as I was thinking about this panel, it seemed to me that there were a couple of things that we could talk about. Well, a lot of things we could talk about, but for me, for both legislators and election officials, I think if we look back over all the changes that we've experienced this year, whether it was the 400 plus pieces of COVID litigation, whether it was legislation, as has been mentioned, of how can we respond to this moment in just this moment and allow for certain things to happen, or if there were executive orders that allowed for certain administrative practices in the elections, we really need to take a look at all of those things. What were they? Did they work? And as Senator Ivey-Soto mentioned, should we do this moving forward? Why and why not? And I think at that point, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up that we need to really turn to the various inputs of data that we will get around things like rejection rates of vote by mail or absentee ballots, and why they were rejected. Was it because they were late? Was that a lack of proper messaging? Was it a signature issue because of the design of the envelopes? Were they late because there was a postal service problem? Were they late because I'm in one of the 8 states that allows for the ballot to be requested on Monday for Tuesday's election? There are things that we need to look at, dates, deadlines, some of those protocols. Also looking at the provisional ballot rates and what occurred. So we know that there were a lot of voters that requested vote by mail ballots and then went to the polls to vote in person for a wide variety of reasons. So we had a lot of provisional ballots in places that used paper poll books and didn't have electronic poll books where they could have real time or at least fairly current information about the voters. So that kind of sets us up to what are some of the categories. So we know that a lot of this litigation stemmed around the type of options voters were given and whether or not election officials were flexible or could be flexible in this moment to figure out how to service their voters well. So in a state, is there a prohibition on exactly what type of facility can be used as a polling place? Schools were mentioned, but there are other places where it has to be a government building. Well, that can be a challenge when government buildings are all shut down or what have you, or who can be a poll worker? Can they serve in a precinct outside of their home precinct where they're registered? There's a lot of discussion, of course, around vote by mail, absentee voting, voting at home, around both the applications, which were discussed, how ballots could be returned, when they could be returned, the security of it, and what policies are in place to make sure that there is integrity to that process. And I would argue there are a lot of policies in place. And then the processing and the timeliness of that. And then lastly, I would say that there was a lot of mis and disinformation that influenced our voters in this moment. And it's important that states have post-election audits, have logic and accuracy tests, that they can explain and in a transparent way, educate their voters, legislators as well, around what's already being done in a state. I was very frustrated to hear legislators in some states advocating for audits when they literally passed audit legislation in the last 2 years to implement things like risk limiting audits and other types of audits. So I find that that's a bit of a challenge. So I would say moving forward, something to contemplate in this year is for legislators, election officials, have a day where all across your state, the legislators spend the day going into election offices in their districts. Pick, you might have one, you might have five, so you may not be able to hit all of them, but who are your facilities? Talk to your local election officials, talk to them about the challenges they faced. Election officials, invite your legislators to your state association meetings. Have a whole session where you can talk about the challenges that you're facing and what would help you. Sometimes it's as mundane as revisiting the type of language that has to be on the envelope for an absentee ballot. What does that affidavit say? Because oftentimes it's so complicated that voters aren't reading it and then they're failing to sign and that sort of thing. So I'll leave it at that, but I think that there's a lot of work we have to do. I think everyone responded in this moment in an amazing way. This election could have gone very, very differently from the administrative perspective of it. I'm so thankful that we did see historic turnout and that voters were able to participate and had options in keeping their families safe. And then one last thing is yesterday I was on watching the Bipartisan Policy Center panel, and Marcy Andino, who's the state elections director in South Carolina, put it this way: we can measure the success of an election in a variety of ways. Did your candidate win? How long did you have to wait in line? But in this moment, I think we can measure it by the fact that we did not see an immediate impact of COVID after election day. And that's something that I think every election official, every poll worker, everyone else should really be proud of, that in this moment, we didn't see the kind of spikes that we've seen. It wasn't a super spreader event.
Well, Tammy, that was just great. And I love the way you brought the election officials and the legislators back together with that idea of inviting legislators to come to the election officials. And of course, legislators are always welcome to invite officials to come to see them in the legislature as well. We've got a couple of comments here about funding and resources. And I think none of you quite hit the nail hard, not on the head, but you didn't hit it hard, that resources relate to good elections. So Tammy, I'm just going to go ahead and start with you, and then anybody else who'd like to answer, just let me know and we'll get you in on that too. What's the role of resources in this?
I think part of the challenge that we have is the episodic funding of elections, how it happens usually as a reaction to something bad. So HAVA came about after 2000. We did have some influx of funding in response to COVID. We saw some influx of federal funding after the 2016 and the cybersecurity challenges that we faced. But that doesn't help you to plan. It doesn't help you to plan your next budget, your next cycle of when you can replace your voting equipment, when you can hire additional people, when you can upgrade, modernize, what have you. So we really need to talk about what does it look like to have all vested partners ponying up to conduct our elections. And in this moment, I think we were incredibly fortunate that there was philanthropic dollars that went into the support of nonprofits, doing training, providing some of those envelopes, Senator Walker, that we talked about. The Center for Civic Design has a template of great envelopes. We've worked with the Postal Service on envelopes that'll get through the mail stream without problems. And so there's been that sort of funding, but in this moment, that direct funding of local election officials through the Center for Civic Design or Center for Technology and Civic Life. I had local election officials who told me with tears in their eyes, they were able to conduct the election they felt they needed to and they wanted to by hiring the right amount of people, by getting the PPE that they needed. But we shouldn't have to rely on Anheuser-Busch to provide us with hand sanitizers or Arnold Schwarzenegger to buy drop boxes for local election offices. We should have the right amount of funding throughout the course of the election cycle, because far too often it comes in right at the end. And then there's this pointing that goes on and says, look, they didn't even spend it. Well, you can't give people a bunch of money a month or 2 months right before an election and expect it to have the same kind of impact. So I think that can be, part of the conduit here is that we need to have a formula where there's a steady stream. And one last piece of this, and then I'll get off my soapbox, is that we do have a solution that also puts some of the payment responsibility on the federal government without any of the additional onus of policy implications. So we know that right now, military and overseas voters, the postage is paid through congressional appropriations. Expand that for all absentee voting, all vote by mail. The channel's already there. And then that way the postage is paid. It'll go out first class because Congress is paying for it. It would be a blip on their radar in their budget, but it would alleviate a lot of those questions around whether or not some voters have to try and find a stamp. In other states, voters don't have to. There are solutions to some of these challenges.
Mark, I'm going to come to you in just a moment to address funding, because I bet you've got some opinions on the role of the local, and I see Senator Ivey-Soto too. But I do want to say to everybody that we've put in the chat box the topics that surfaced from the initial comments from our panelists. And now for everyone who's listening, I'd like to ask you to put a comment about the one that we've missed, what should be on that list, or comment on the ones that you think you might say should be upvoted. So that's in there. Mark, what can you say about funding and resources?
Yeah, and this is my opportunity, I think, to talk to legislators specifically. Fund elections. I mean, bottom line is fund elections. We saw a lot of third parties, and I do think there's a role for nonprofits to play in elections. Don't think there's a role when it comes to contributing funds to an election. We spent a lot of time thinking about that in Tennessee, and I ended up having a county that did take some nonprofit funds for their election, but we didn't on a state level. I didn't know that type after the fact. And here's what it broke it down for me. Suppose you go back to 2014 or 2012, and we had a similar situation. And I'm going to make this bipartisan, say that, at this point, Donald Trump's not running for election, nor is Mike Bloomberg. But say that both of those individuals contributed to a nonprofit, separate nonprofits, and suddenly the funds were offered to election commission offices. I got to tell you, election commission offices were struggling. They needed funds. And so it's very tempting to take those funds from these third parties. But now fast forward, both of those were candidates in 2020. How does that look from an election official standpoint, that we've had funds that may have been, and that, I'm not saying that's what happened in 2020. I'm just saying that is a slippery slope that you can go down when you're looking at other individuals funding a government function. And so legislators, I really want you to take it hard and it turns out for us in Tennessee, we ended up having enough funds to fund our election. We did have some CARES Acts that helped fund those elections, but and this wasn't something that, we were very tempted. We had $800,000 we could have taken on the state level, and we could have done some great things with it. And I'm not knocking the nonprofits for offering it. They saw a need and they came in there. But also coming from someone who's ran for an office, the other slippery slope could come this way. We're all involved in when you're a candidate, you want to get folks out to vote, and you have different get out the vote type activities that you do, and you target your votes. Well, you could tailor those grants to do some of your get out the vote activities if you wanted to. And so I think that's something that the legislators need to take a look at, but I'm not saying go out there and ban third parties from coming in and funding elections, and do nothing else. I'm saying fund elections. And the other thing that I've learned is that at the courthouse, typically your election officials, or at least in some of the areas that I'm aware of, they're the lowest folks it comes to salary that there is. Well, when you look take the pandemic out of the equation, I've been coordinator for 12 years. Prior to that, I served on the state election commission, and prior to that, I was on election subcommittee as a legislator. But what I know now as coordinator that I didn't know as a legislator is the immense stress that election officials are under, no matter what election. There was a time where every single year when there was an election cycle, I didn't know what county, but I knew I was going to have an election administrator or an election official in the hospital close to election day just because of the stress they were under. Imagine, when you're a legislator and there's a big tax issue coming up or something like that, you're getting cussed at, fussed at. Some are praying for you, appreciate the prayers, but that we are dealing in one of the most sensitive areas that you can deal in, and everything we do is criticized, and you can do everything almost perfect, but that one little thing that someone else out, maybe, there's a lot of moving parts that may go wrong, it could ruin your career, and everyone knows that in elections. So my bet, if I were to beg and plead, keep the third party funds out of elections, because it could open up questions later on, and legislators fund elections as best you can. And I know it's very tough being a legislator because you have a lot of things competing at you. But if we can't get elections right and make sure that we're keeping the integrity of the process right, we blow everything, because the folks that are making the budgetary decisions, they get there through an election. So I really think it's very important that y'all take a look at this issue. And trust me, I am not throwing anything at any third party that stepped in. I'm just saying the slippery slope that you can get into. And election officials needed funds. They saw an opportunity to get those funds, but realistically, it needs to come from the legislature or the county legislative bodies, so you can figure out where this money's going.
So Senator Ivey-Soto, I'm coming to you in just half a second. Senator Walker, I want to put you on deck to answer the question that Sarah asked about how can election officials or others get the message to their legislators. So I'll ask you that. But Senator Ivey-Soto, jump in, and if you could say something about federal funding as well as state and local, that'd be great.
Yeah, actually, that was where I was planning to start.
Okay.
So you read my mind. Here's the thing. When the HAVA funds came through in 2002 and ultimately came out around 2006, up until then, from 1791 until 2006, the federal government had gotten a free ride on elections. We'd elected people for the federal government at the state level, at the local level, and the federal government had never paid a penny towards those elections. Think about that. And then what they did is that they sent billions of dollars to the states, and then once again said, okay, we sent money, not our problem anymore. And until CARES Act funding, we got a little bit more money coming through. And so one of the things that really needs to happen at the federal level is we need to figure out a regular funding stream for elections, not a bunch of money at one point, because that actually is a shock to the system. The other thing that I do want to was going to address one of the things about people talking to legislators about this issue, because part of the disconnect, and this is a real frustration for me, part of the as a legislator, it's a real I see the disconnect as frustration, and that is elections are the mechanism by which we have the legitimacy to do everything else we do. It doesn't matter what the priority for any given legislator is. They only have the authority to pursue that priority that they have, spaying and neutering dogs, whatever it is, because of an election. And yet, consistently throughout this country, we underfund elections. And I think that's a huge problem that we have, and it's a lack of understanding. One of the lack of understandings that you have with the budget people is that elections, there's a firm date for an election, and so when you have to buy things, you need it delivered. You need to pay whatever it is you got to pay to get it delivered on time for that election. You don't have the option of waiting in line to get it delivered later on. And so the budget people don't understand, you know, when COVID hit and we had to buy a bunch of PPE, right? Our budget people were upset that the Secretary of State's office ended up paying a premium for the PPE that they got, that they distributed throughout to all the different counties for all the polling places. But the thing is that other agencies, they bought PPE, but then they had to wait until the delivery came. We didn't have that option, and they don't have an understanding of how that works. So that's one of the real challenges. And just to answer Shannon's comment in the chat room, elections are the credibility. Elections are the basis for the credibility, or for the authority we have, not credibility, for the authority we have to do everything else, because we don't have any authority without an election. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And that local, state, federal line is very complicated, confusing, and we need some money from all levels, I would say. And what I'm hearing is consistent is better than episodic. Senator Walker, if there are local election officials who want to talk to their elected officials, folks like you, on why funding is important, how do they do it? 1 or 2 tips on how you like to be approached when you're in your legislative role.
So just in Indiana, both the House and Senate chairmen live in the same county, represent the same people. And our local county chair was also president of the Clerks Association. So that's how you get it done. But seriously, the issue being legislators are independent contractors, and no one can seem to find the general anywhere, right? So we all tend to look at elections from our own perspective. Hey, I got reelected, then elections are out of sight, out of mind. As it's been done in Indiana and hopefully elsewhere, I'm sure, building those relationships and helping people understand the work that goes into it year round, I think is very important, so that it's not an out of mind, out of sight kind of problem. I thought that the conversation from the standpoint of the consent of the governor from our senator in New Mexico is very important, which plays into the trust issue that came up earlier. The local election officials are just going to have to work to establish those relationships and stress the amount of confidence that people have to put in them to get this done right. If you start trolling around right now, you'll find all kinds of concerns that we're going to have secession from states. We're going to have armed resistance to setting a president-elect. Kind of things I never would have imagined I have heard ever in this country. I've never heard them before. And all of this arises from a confidence in that local person, that county level person. And they, for all the stress that they have been in prior to this election cycle, my heart goes out to all those at the state and county level that have felt that this year. But you just got to, we also have to acknowledge that with federal, state, and local monies being used in elections, it allows for a lot of finger pointing. And I think that you probably need to sit down with legislators as election officials and map out, well, who's responsible for what in terms of the spending. So we have a central registration system, but all those counties maintain local information. Indiana requires the local counties to purchase all of the voting systems and voting machines. So we had a change in legislation a year ago requiring voter verified paper trail printers be added where there are electronic tabulation devices that don't have that capability. In the law, we put in there that we're going to get that done the next 10 years. We gave counties 10 years. So they're going to fully depreciate equipment at that point that was maybe bought in the 80s or 90s. And instead of giving them or finding them the resources to make those purchases, we just rolled out the implementation date for a decade. And I think that's an unfortunate result of not being able to hold anyone specifically accountable for the whole system of elections because of the multiple funding sources.
Great. So when I said before that there were the 3 sources, local, state, and federal, I dropped out the philanthropic part, and which probably doesn't relate at all to the buying of equipment. Keesha, would you just take a moment to talk about how the philanthropic community can play a role, not in buying PPE, not in buying equipment, but in supporting voters more broadly? And then I'm going to come around for a lightning round with everybody.
Sure. I think the challenge is that for philanthropy, in my opinion, what philanthropy should be doing in the democratic space, we should be funding innovation, ideation. How do we work with voters? How do we work with idea makers to actually have opportunities to elevate ways to get people more involved and engaged in democracy? But because of some of the factors that the senators have identified, we're forced to enter to support the infrastructure of democracy that has failed to be funded at the state and federal level to ensure that our democracy works in a comprehensive way, because our government actors do not see themselves as essential actors to seeing that our comprehensive democracy works for everyone. And that is actually a huge problem. Civil society and philanthropy does not have enough resources to come in and actually make up the difference for a failure of government to do this work. And philanthropy will continue to do what we can when we can. And I do think it's absolutely essential. And I think that philanthropy really did step up to the plate in this last cycle in some really strong and important ways. I think that many of the organizations, everything from Center for Technology and Civic Life. I think Tammy named a lot of them, Democracy Works, many of the others that did incredible work. And we really appreciate their interventions within this space. But what we should be doing to improve and engage and support advocates, support voting rights attorneys, support folks who are really looking to better engage around our democracy, to make sure that everyone on both sides of the aisle, to make sure that independents, to look at alternative voting systems, to look at all these things to make our democracy better, to make it more robust, to challenge our systems, is really where philanthropy should be engaging at its best and most robust. When philanthropy is actually taking the place of government and governance systems, is really a failure of a lot of the systems. And I think that's really, it's disappointing. And so it's my hope that as we work with our advocates and we work with legislators, and we work with elected officials to see how can we best support to actually right-size this boat, to actually help correct some of the things that we've actually identified here. How can we be most supportive to actually figure out how do we right-size this ship and really start to say, how do we help governance and government systems to actually fund this stuff properly, so we can engage in the ways that actually make and improve our democracy in ways that we can actually support some of our best and brightest thinkers in civil society to actually come in and actually make a more robust democracy.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. And I know that you've been doing that, so it's not like that's a new thought for the 2020s. That's something that's been going on for some length of time. Okay, we are running out of time. I'm going to ask each of you to give me one idea that you think might boost voter confidence. You get to choose, but it would be great if we ended up with 5 different ideas. Tammy, I'm coming to you last. Let's see. What the heck, Mark? I see you up there. What's one idea on voter confidence?
Well, I think the election officials, from our standpoint, we're just going to have to be out in the community, show the transparency of the process, and make everyone understand that, you know, in a properly conducted election, it's bipartisan. So when you're doing a lot of these functions, you know, for example, in Tennessee and probably most states, the absentee ballot boxes where the ballots are contained, there's 2 locks. There's a Republican lock, there's a Democrat lock. And the Republican can unlock both, and the Democrat can unlock both. There's seals that's placed on those, and there's a chain of custody that goes along with that. So I really think that I do think that we do have an obligation to go out there and build trust. Now, we had the same thing 4 years ago, though. It was a little different with you know, misinformation and those things, but a lot of folks were putting that into elections. Or you had a lot about internet, you know, that we were being scanned. Well, that too took some education. You know, scan just meant someone was coming up and looking through the window. It didn't mean they got in the window. But anybody that's on a computer, that's on the internet, they're going to have someone coming up looking in the window. They're going to be scanned at some point. And so we did the same thing 4 years ago, but I do think that the confidence in elections is worse shape than it was 4 years ago. And I think it just continues to build because of various things. But we've got to do this. And the same thing in some other elections. But election officials got to be out in the public and just let them know that the transparency in the system, the checks and balances that are there.
Okay, Lee and Larry, I'm going to keep going for 3 more minutes unless you cut me off cold. Senator Walker, then Senator Ivey-Soto, then Keesha, then Tammy. What could we do to improve voter confidence? And we have transparency and some voter education on the table at this point.
We had a municipal election recount that was one vote was the deciding vote last year in Bartholomew County, Columbus, Indiana. And I sat through the entire recount process. It was the most boring thing I've ever seen because everyone did their job. There was not a lot of controversy. There was no yelling. And so I don't know how we overcome the hype that has arisen from accusations falsely of all kinds of fraud and you name it. But I think it's going to be the work of getting to individuals one at a time. I don't see a tool that's available to us to overcome the kind of media sensation that was made for 4 years prior to this election cycle about how untrusted it was going to be. So if that's, I don't know, inviting local people, if you test the machines, again, part of the process that is so commonplace, pull machines at random, test them, make sure that the test, and no one from the public shows up for the test. They don't want to understand the process. They want to complain about the misconceptions or the misimage. So I think it's just going to have to be attacking those folks that want to challenge you prior to. We've got to settle this before the election happens, so that people can't come in after the fact and point fingers and say, "Well, you never showed me how that worked," or "I don't understand what you're doing." So we got to get sexier somehow. We can't have these boring elections. We got to get people excited about democracy.
This is the very first time I've heard anybody say we got to make elections sexier. So let's let that be one of our takeaways. Senator Ivey-Soto.
Thank you, Wendy. It is when elections work correctly, you're right, it's absolutely boring. And one of the things, and I do want to go to one of the questions that Ed Kashmarek asked, which is why don't we go to standardized procedures across the country? And actually, if you want a non-hackable situation, you want different ways of administering it and slightly different rules. It's actually a strength of our democracy that we do things differently as opposed to a defect. But the problem that happens is that when we get to all the national 24-hour national news, when they start talking about things, they don't always know what those local rules are. And so, in terms of restoring confidence in elections, certainly those people who are in election administration tend to be people who want to go to work, serve their community, and go home to their families, and need to start stepping up and bragging about what they do and letting people know, as well as making sure that we communicate better in advance of an election about what happens. Most folks, elections seem insecure until you realize all of the different checks and balances that happen with an election. And the security protocols truly are there, but you don't know that unless you're on the inside.
Absolutely true. There's checks and balances from well before the first ballot goes out to long afterwards. Keesha, some thoughts about voter confidence quickly? I did get permission to go a few minutes over, so Tammy, we're not cutting you off.
I would say traditional media campaign, social media campaign, and returning basic civics to public schools.
Boy, that was great. Can we adopt that agenda? Traditional media, social media, and some civics. Great, thank you. Tammy, what you got?
I want to take all of that, put a big bow on it, because all of those things were things that I had jotted down.
Great.
I think part of the challenge here is that when we do need to be transparent, we do need to educate our public and our citizenry on what they're seeing. So it doesn't matter if I have an affidavit of someone saying that they saw an election official marking a stack of ballots and then running them through a machine. Yeah, they could be doing a logic and accuracy test. They could be duplicating ballots. So when we, and this was one of the comments in the in the Q&A about all these affidavits, I can attest and swear and believe that I'm seeing what I think I'm seeing, but unless we really understand how our democracy works and plays out, it doesn't matter. We need to make sure that people understand the process, have faith in the process, and moving forward, continue to participate in the level that they are. So if you're someone who has questions, educate yourself, reach out to local election officials, get out of the silo, listen to other people, talk to more people. And I think that's where we're going to hopefully start to heal some of the gashes and the wounds that have been exposed before the next big election comes around.
Wow. So we have Christmas coming up and we all get to have our lists. And I now know what my Christmas list is, what I'd like to get for Christmas. Now, it's possible that Santa won't be able to deliver everything that's just been mentioned, but we've captured it. And if there's anything extra, by all means, throw it in. And if you think of it after the fact, send it to, well, me, Wendy.Underhill@ncsl.org if you want to, and we'll make sure this gets in the mix for whatever comes next for this University of Minnesota NCSL partnership. For now, I want to say thank you to all the people who put those wonderful comments in the chat box, and thank you to all of our participants for bringing your very best game to this today. And I guess with that, I'll say stay calm for the rest of the year and see you in 2021. Thank you.